It's widely acknowledged that there is an exponential increase in income inequality since 1980 to today in terms of the United States, but there could be another form of inequality forming with artificial intelligence. And I wanted to talk about it into a little bit more detail here because I'm seeing some interesting trends with the rise of this concept of expertise inequality. Here's a good example where I see people talking about automating coders or, we don't need to hire software developers anymore. I think it's a much more complex problem than is really being put on the surface. So first, here's one example in terms of a scenario for automating a software developer. Imagine someone comes up and says, I want to fully automate software development, and so I'm going to use AI to do this. Here's a great scenario. Imagine they decide to go to AWS and they want to start building some kind of web service, etc. How would they know where to start if they have no experience as a software engineer? Which of the 8 or 10 different compute options on AWS should they pick? Should they pick Amazon EC2, so classic virtual machines, infrastructure as a service, or should they pick serverless? And then if they want to pick serverless, which serverless option? Should they pick AWS Lambda? Should they pick AWS ECS Fargate? Should they pick AWS EKS? Or should they pick maybe not full serverless? Maybe they want something a little closer to traditional web development, and they should pick Elastic Beanstalk. And then which type of Elastic Beanstalk do they want to use? Do they want to use containerized Elastic Beanstalk, or do they want to use virtual machines? So where I'm going here is that it's one thing to say I want to automate something, or I want to get rid of human expertise, but the devil is in the details. And the details here are that it requires incredible experience, incredible critical thinking skills, and also domain expertise to even understand how to automate someone's job, because there's so many different choices and so many different features. And I think that compute selection option is a pretty good example. So even if you're a deep expert on AWS, even with 10 years of experience, you might yourself not know all of the different scenarios that you would use one compute option with another compute option, and what are some of the subtle details. So just blindly asking a chatbot for some information may give you a surface level answer that doesn't really get to the depth that you need to make an informed decision. And this is why we are going to see a rise of expertise inequality. Now, if you're a deep expert, this is a very different scenario where you may actually know the kinds of things you're looking to do. So for example, maybe you want to build a Lambda function. This is where the expertise inequality could really play itself out. So you already know the benefits of serverless, you know about event-driven development. And at this point, why would you use a scripting language to build a Lambda? It's going to have a lower cost if you'd use a compiled language, lower latency. It's going to have a smaller runtime, smaller packaging. The deployment story is a lot better. So for example, why wouldn't you use the safest language available? In this case, it would be Rust. And you can get maybe 50 millisecond response time. You can get 1 megabyte binaries. You can also cross-compile to ARM. You can do all these really incredible things by using a modern compiled language. And this is a very different scenario than just trying to say, hey, I want to run some web service. Like, first of all, do you even know what the difference is between a website and a web service? Do you know the different kinds of web services, JSON-based, REST-based? What kind of web service you're trying to build? Maybe a Lambda-based service or WebSockets, right? So in this case, the expertise really does matter, and the depth of what you know really does matter. And this could lead to the senior type developers really getting more and more jobs because they can leverage the power of AI. And people that have no experience, there could be less of a need to hire people with no experience. Likewise, for dysfunctional organizations that are driven by HIPPO, so highest paid person's opinion, where the CEO who doesn't have programming experience, or the founder who is kind of a tinkerer or a dilettante comes in and says, hey, Python is the most popular language, let's all use Python. Or maybe a course provider or a university says, we see that Python is the most popular language, and so we're only going to build courses or curriculum with Python. How would they know? Have they ever built production software? What was the last thing that they built? Was it 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Just because you understand at a surface level the concept of Python, do you actually understand why a modern compiled language would be a better choice? So the dilettantes and the bureaucracy that exists all across not just the United States, but the world, and also at the university system, at the corporate level, this also could play out in terms of a rise of expertise inequality, because those organizations already were a step behind because they don't understand the latest technology. They may think they do, but they don't. And likewise, they have huge operational overhead problems where there's a HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion, coming in, randomizing developers. And so the slowness that they have in developing features is even accelerated more where smaller teams that have deep expertise, maybe someone is ex-Google, or they're, a previous CTO that works for themselves, the individual developer with 20 plus years experience could potentially already outcompete maybe 100-person company, or deliver in one day what a company could deliver in 365 days. But now what could happen in this kind of an era, we could see the rise of expertise inequality really start to create distance. And so could established players, for example, get completely obliterated within the course of a couple of years. I think these are some of the scenarios that could really be very disruptive in terms of artificial intelligence. Well, in this case, the generative AI based artificial intelligence, which has very little intelligence associated with it. So I think that's one thing to watch for. Now, let's also get into, since the word intelligence came up, what do we really mean by AI and generative AI? And I think it's important to classify what is the value that a coding assistant is giving you, and what are the things that it can help you do. As I mentioned before, I think the real value is in the hands of a deep expert. This is where these systems do the best. I've heard other people say things like it's a expert system, something I dealt with when I was in graduate school. I worked with expert systems. So an expert system is great if someone has all of the rules defined, where you're able to deal with these rules and basically accelerate what you're already doing. Likewise, if you look at some of the features of what really is happening with a tool like Claude, for example, when it helps you, it's a little bit like Stack Overflow. So in the old days, before there was these generative AI tools, people would Google something and then they would look for Stack Overflow, or they look for some website that had the answer. Or even before that existed, I would call up a friend and say, hey, or email them, I don't know how this works, or I don't know how that works. And so you're asking other people for help and for advice. This is really common. This has been happening for quite some time. Does that mean that it's intelligent, or that it's a panacea? No, you're just getting some information somewhere where a lot of the solution is already built for you. So you could say that the current iteration of generative AI tools, and I don't think they're going to get much better, is a little bit like an enhanced Stack Overflow. I would say that's a pretty large component of what it is. So if you think about it that way, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is what I've already been doing for years and years and years. I'm just looking at pre-baked answers that are pretty close. One big difference is that because you can feed it your context, the answer you're going to get is a little closer to what you need, but again, not perfect. You still have to understand what's happening. A second component of what are some of the things that you get from generative AI tools, I would say it's a little bit like a fancier search engine as well. So again, a little bit related to Stack Overflow, but slightly different in that I remember when logging and monitoring was a big deal, and people would start to get more and more logging and monitoring with distributed systems. And then eventually you didn't know what was happening because you had too many log files and too much data. And there started to emerge companies that would help you search that data. In fact, I was the head of engineering for a company that managed log data. And the idea here is that you can find patterns quickly with a search engine that will let you find anomalies or find different issues that are happening with code. And so I think I also put a component of the generative AI tools in that category. So it's like Splunk or one of these kinds of logging tools, or AWS CloudWatch or New Relic, where it can detect errors for you, like by clustering or anomaly detection. So really the majority of the functionality from generative AI is just a small improvement over what's already occurred over the last 20 years in software development, with answer sites like Stack Overflow, or books from a book publisher like O'Reilly, or search engines like Splunk. And so if you look at things from the history of innovation, you see that, for example, the steam engine, I think first came out in maybe the 17th century, and then slowly iterated. They made the steam engine because they wanted to pump water out of the ground in a mine, which makes sense. And then they slowly said, hey, we can put it onto a boat and we can make boats go. And then they just kept iterating. And hey, we don't want steam, we want an internal combustion engine. And then there was an electric car, and then the electric car took 100 something years to really take off. You can see that this is the way innovation works, is that it builds upon things that happened in the past and slightly improves them. So there's no reason why the generative AI tools would be any different. If we look at the use cases that are emerging, it's really an improvement on past innovations. So in the case of Stack Overflow, or in the case of search engines like Splunk. And so what does this mean? It means that, again, the expert is really at the center of the story. The better the expert, the better the result you're going to get, where we're going to get diminishing returns with these tools. They're in perfect competition. Every day a new tool comes out, a new player comes out. Eventually we'll get to the point where it'll be perfect competition, and every single vendor will be identical. And eventually what will happen as well is the open source solutions will be just as good. Many of them are starting to get pretty close to the top tier models. And then when that happens, what's going to be the differentiator? It's still going to be expertise. So that's why it's important to really kind of summarize everything here and look into the future. So what's really going to happen with AI coding? What's going to happen is that the expert will become more valuable. So we're going to see a rise of expertise inequality. Deep experts are going to be in huge demand, because these deep experts know how to get the most out of the results. We could see a retraction in beginners in terms of their value, because they don't have that domain experience, and domain experience is becoming very, very valuable. We also could see, as a result of the rise of expertise inequality, is that these companies that were already not functioning well, where it takes someone a year to do what an individual could do in a day, we could see an acceleration of their demise. So if you're talking about companies that are driven by HIPAA or VPs or the provost, or whatever dysfunctional leader is in top of that organization, you could see a very quick demise. So really, to sum things up here, the rise of expertise inequality could also start to be just as scary and just as provocative as the rise of income inequality.